Welcome back. You're watching France 24. Coming up, Yellow Vest protesters decline an invitation to meet with the Prime Minister Tuesday. Edouard Philippe, who's been meeting with opposition leaders as Paris cleans up from Saturday's rioting. To add to Yellow Vest protests, you've had students and ambulance drivers rallying against reforms this Monday. As scientists sound the alarm at the UN Climate Summit in Poland, the World Bank announces a doubling to 200 billion euros of its investment plan for energy transition in developing nations. Coalition talks underway in Andalusia after Spain's first regional poll since the return to democracy that features an election of far-right representatives. After the news, the France 24 debate, give in or crack down? What's Emmanuel Macron's answer to a Yellow Vest movement now in its 17th day? We're going to be taking stock from a second weekend of rioting in Paris. Have your say on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag F24Debate. France's president has postponed a two-day trip to Serbia that was due to start on Wednesday. And as Paris cleans up from what the mayor calls its worst Saturday of rioting since May 1968, the Yellow Vests have now rejected a Tuesday invitation to meet the Prime Minister. Edouard Philippe, who earlier sat down with political leaders from across the political spectrum, the leaderless movement now in its 17th day and counting, with protests first against fuel tax hikes, but whose demands now run the gamut. Let's get more now from France 24's Clément Bonnereau, who is at the Prime Minister's offices. So there you have it, Clément. In the past few minutes, Yellow Vests saying they won't be attending talks where you are on Tuesday.
Indeed, and it's nothing surprising, really. There was a lot of uncertainty around this meeting all afternoon. No one really knew whether it was going to take place, whether it was going to happen. I actually spoke to one of the representatives who was invited tomorrow to the talks, and he told us that he would not come simply because he's received death threats from other members of the Yellow Vest movement, radical members of the movement. He also said he simply did not want to be a puppet of the government. He wants the government to listen, and he says that right now the government is not really ready to negotiate.
Not really ready to negotiate, so there are no negotiations happening, bar, of course, the discussions that have been taking place that you've been witnessing with the leaders of the various opposition parties.
Indeed, Edouard Philippe held talks with party leaders and parliamentary leaders all day since early this morning, in fact. All the leaders that he spoke to have very different approaches, very different views on how to diffuse the situation, on how to find a way out of all this chaos that we've witnessed over the past few days. The leader of the Socialist Party, Olivier Faure, for example, has called on the government to scrap the green tax on fuel. The leader of the centre-right Les Républicains party agrees. He also called on the government to hold a referendum on green taxes. And then you have both the far left and the far right calling for a snap election, calling on Emmanuel Macron to dissolve Parliament. Of course, these proposals will be of little use for the government. Obviously, the government has refused to back down on this tax, and also obviously new elections, early elections, are definitely not on the agenda.
Clément Bonnereau reporting live from the French Prime Minister's offices at Paris Central Courts this Monday. The number of hearings doubled as the state presses charges against dozens of the more than 400 arrested on Saturday. Far from the cameras, France's president had lunch at a police barracks in the northeast of Paris, where he sat down with some of those still recovering. Emerald Maxwell has more.
Police officers tried to prevent protesters from defacing the Arc de Triomphe on Saturday, but they're outflanked by rioters throwing makeshift missiles.
Bits of cobblestone, street furniture, homemade explosives, some threw acid.
Oui, des jets d'acide. Et pour vous dire à peu près
To give you an idea of the kind of thing we were up against, they were well equipped, so they took apart the railings to use the tops as arrows.
Jesse Castan was with his unit at Place Charles de Gaulle, the large junction of the Champs-Élysées. He was hit by projectiles a number of times, hurting his hand and back. Nearly a third of the 80 men in his unit were injured.
I've been working for 20 years, and that was the first time I've been faced with such violence. The troublemakers wanted more than just a fight. I'm convinced that if they'd been able to, they would have killed us.
To push back the rioters, his unit fired more than 800 tear gas grenades. Not once that day were the officers relieved, and by evening, the air was almost unbreathable. Castan's unit was also on duty at the last two protests in Paris.
My unit has worked all three protests so far, and we've seen the violence getting worse and worse. We're now asking ourselves, will they bring real weapons to the next one? It's a real fear.
In total, 133 people were injured, including 23 officers, 5 times more than the protest a week earlier.
Yeah, and the Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe, cancelling his trip to the COP24 UN climate conference in Poland. Instead, France, represented by the country's environment minister, and while the government here has gone to great pains to insist it's doing all it can to make sure a carbon tax doesn't unduly punish the poor, the UN Secretary General in Katowice has been sounding the alarm, calling on all nations to enact urgent measures.
We are way off course. We need more action and more ambition, and we absolutely have to close this emissions gap. If we fail, the Arctic and the Antarctic will continue to melt. Corals will bleach and then die. The oceans will rise. More people will die from air pollution. Water scarcity will plague a significant proportion of humanity, and the cost of disasters will skyrocket.
It's not all doom and gloom in Katowice. France 24's Gulliver Cragg has more.
The World Bank has pledged to contribute $200 billion to climate finance over the next 5 years. That is a huge amount, and what's also interesting is that they stressed that a lot of this money would be for adaptation rather than mitigation. That means helping countries out when they've suffered a climate-related disaster or building seawalls and things like that. But climate finance specialists here are saying that that's not actually all new money. Some of that was already announced. It's also dependent in part on the goodwill of private contributors to do their part to contribute to that sum. But certainly it's a lot of money, and it was obviously announced here on the first full day of the conference in the hopes that it would give the impetus to other countries to dig deep into their pockets when discussions about climate finance are taking place.
Gulliver Cragg. Another blow for mainstream politics in Europe. For the first time since Spain's return to democracy after the death of Franco in 1975, the far right has elected officials. In Andalusia, the anti-migrant, anti-feminist, Eurosceptic Vox party, winning 12 seats. Vox, which could play kingmaker in the regional parliament there.
Cheers of joy at the Vox party headquarters in Seville. Just a few moments earlier, Spanish media projected the party would win 12 seats in Andalusia's regional parliament. This election result is nothing short of unprecedented. It is the first time a regional parliament will include far-right politicians since Spain returned to democracy following Francisco Franco's military dictatorship.
Andalusians once again have made history, as they've done many times in the past. They have shaken off 36 years of a socialist regime, paving the way for the rest of the Spanish people by saying that it is possible to do the same in the rest of the country.
Vox is a populist party which promotes economic liberalism. It has come out against same-sex marriage and against abortion. But lately it has shifted its tone, pushing anti-Islam and anti-immigration messages. And that has struck a chord among some supporters.
It's always the cleverest person who comes out on top, or in this case, the person who steals. So we end up with people who are tired, who work hard and who get nothing. We have no rights. They've handed all those rights to other people. But who are those people really?
Andalusia has been ruled by the Spanish Socialist Party for 36 years, and a coalition of right-wing parties may now bring that to an end. The result could spell trouble for Pedro Sanchez's government ahead of local, municipal, and European elections next May.